For 9 days, in the spring of 1940, this beach was the last refuge for hundreds of thousands of British soldiers. Trapped by Hitler's forces and bombed by German aircraft, there seemed no escape.
I felt that nobody's going to get out of this. They're going to get the damn lot of us.
Offshore, the Royal Navy and a flotilla of little ships would pull off the most audacious rescue in British history. But while the little ships passed into legend, the RAF were cast as villains.
At Dunkirk, the RAF was absolutely detested by the Army and the Navy.
Britain's fighter pilots were accused of failing in their duty. Dunkirk was seen as the RAF's poorest hour.
Some of the army were annoyed because there were no Spitfires and Hurricanes around. I can't say that I saw any either.
But newly declassified wartime files are rewriting the history of Britain's miracle escape.
For the first time since World War II, we're actually allowed to see what's inside them.
They overturn a long-standing slur on the RAF, revealing a story of heroic sacrifice in the skies over Dunkirk. This beach is a popular summer playground on the Belgian coast, enjoyed by young families throughout the year. But today, the police and the Belgian army have created an exclusion zone that reaches far out to sea. And this is why they are here. Two deadly Second World War shells were discovered just a few feet beneath the sand. The discovery of wartime shells on this beach is far from unusual. 7 decades ago, this stretch of sand witnessed intense air attacks on soldiers unable to defend themselves. The bomb squad carefully attached plastic explosives. The shells are every bit as lethal today as they were over 70 years ago. To limit the blast damage, before detonation, they rebury the shells deep in the sand. But in the spring of 1940, this coastline was packed with men trapped on the evacuation beaches. This is a photograph taken at the time of soldiers under attack from German aircraft. Bullets, bombs and shells were falling relentlessly on hundreds of thousands of British and French troops. The onslaught from the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, seemed never-ending.
They used to come over every half hour during daylight. You could set your watch to it.
How did the British find themselves in such a perilous position? When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the British sent 150,000 troops into France. Called the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, they were intended to act as a deterrent to further aggression. But on the 10th of May, 1940, Hitler launched his Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Hitler's troops, supported by planes, charged through Belgium and the Netherlands. the British and French forces rushed to meet them head-on, the German army took everyone by surprise. Using fast-moving tanks supported by bombers, the Germans launched an even more powerful attack through the supposedly impenetrable Ardennes forest, pushing the British and French back toward the coast.
When we got there, the whole of Dunkirk was on fire.
There's this great pole of smoke going up from the oil tanks.
I remember the walls were falling down. And the continual noise of the Luftwaffe bombing the docks. We didn't hang about. Sightseeing like.
As the British army was retreating, one Belgian civilian documented the chaos as the bombs fell around him.
All the time. My uncle's father made these photographs in 1940, May 1940s.
So he had his own camera and he was taking photographs while all this was going on?
His camera or family. These have never been published before.
Photographs from the Dunkirk evacuation are extremely rare.
The thing that fascinates me is that these show the British Army in action.
Yep.
They're not
Been laying there for some considerable time.
Well, that's a Tommy's helmet there, I think. Those two are Tommy's helmets. Yep. So it's a mixed grave of French and British soldiers just buried in the sand quite close to the edge of the beach. And this marks the final resting place of the men trying to get off the beaches at Dunkirk. Journey's end for these lads.
Yep.
With casualty numbers rising, the troops were starting to wonder why they were left unprotected.
They were kicking up hell about where's our planes, you know, when we were under such terrible stress with the endless attacks we were getting from the air.
Some of the army were annoyed because there were no Spitfires and Hurricanes around. I can't say that I saw any either.
For the men on the ground, death or capture seemed inevitable, when something extraordinary happened. The Germans suddenly stopped.
On the 23rd of May, the German General von Rundstedt halted the Panzer divisions. Most of the generals under him really couldn't understand why he was doing that. They'd made this incredible move towards the coast. I mean, it was absolutely unprecedented. They'd moved so fast.
Historian Joshua Levine has spent years studying Dunkirk, and particularly the halt order decision. He believes that it was made by Hitler, and it was his deputy, Hermann Goering's idea.
Now, Goering was the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, and what he said to Hitler was, don't leave this to the generals. Instead, let me do it. Let the Luftwaffe do it. The Luftwaffe is Nazi. It supports you. You will get the glory if we finish off the BEF.
For a while, Goering's boast that the Luftwaffe could finish off the British Army looked as though it might succeed.
You heard the aircraft come over and you saw them. I mean, the whole length of the beach was people on it. And they were dive bombing the queue and they couldn't miss. So there was some sacrifice every time there was an air raid.
The Luftwaffe's most feared weapon was the Stuka dive bomber.
That bastard. Noisy sod. I hated them.
I used to make a terrible screeching noise coming out. It was psychological, I think, to try to frighten you, which it did.
Diving down with this awful wailing sound.
Attached to these Stukas, I had sirens.
They machine gunned us a lot.
You just thought, well, am I lucky or am I not lucky?
It now appeared that the skies had been handed over to the Stukas and the Messerschmitts, and the men in the firing line were beginning to ask, where were the RAF?
I got so damn scared, I suppose, and fed up. I thought, well, for Christ's sake, let the next one be mine, because I can't stick this any longer. And let's get it over and done. I'm not going to get out of this, because it seemed inescapable.
And yet, miraculously, despite the apparent absence of the RAF, men were escaping. Offshore, an armada of ships was gathering to come and save them. It was a desperate attempt to rescue at least some of the fleeing army.
At the very beginning, Churchill estimated that with luck, something like 30,000 people would get off. Things didn't look good for the British Expeditionary Force. Things looked very, very bleak indeed.
Day after day, the bombardment continued, while the soldiers made their escape. But even when they did manage to get away, catastrophe awaited them. And for some, there would be no going home. May 1940. The Royal Navy has sent a flotilla of ships from Britain to rescue the hundreds of thousands of troops trapped on the Dunkirk beaches. It will become known as the Miracle of Dunkirk.
Oh, the feeling is indescribable. I thought, damn it, I'm going to make it.
But realizing an escape plan had been hatched, the Luftwaffe started bombing Dunkirk harbor, where the evacuation fleet was heading. So the troops were ordered to the beaches to the east of the town. But that left a major problem. The gently shelving beaches were unsuitable for rescue. It was impossible for the big ships to reach the soldiers. There was only one way to get to the boats waiting offshore, and it was fraught with danger.
When we see the iconic images of men on beaches like this, we do see almost orderly queues of men going out to the ships, going out to the point where they can swim out to a vessel and get away.
The process of getting 500 men out to the waiting ships took up to 8 hours. They desperately needed to speed things up. The roads to Dunkirk were littered with abandoned lorries, now of no value to the army. However, when driven onto the sand at low tide, they were to become priceless.
So they came up with the idea of a lorry pier, where they drive lorries onto the beach, and we've got a captured German photo here showing such a lorry pier. They drive the lorries onto the beach, line them up side by side, front of the lorry here, rear of the lorry here, and then put planking on the top, so the planking enables them to walk across the roofs of the lorries, get down there quickly. At high tide, the water will be lapping up both sides, and there'll be lots of little boats available to then ferry them from the far end of the lorry pier out to sea to the bigger boats.
With the halt order over, the German troops were once again on the advance. It would take them no more than a day and a half before they overran the beaches.
the German artillery had moved up and had started being able to drop shells on the beach. That was the time to get out.
All the while, they were still being targeted from the air.
We just sort of lie on the sand and pray. I don't think there were many atheists at Dunkirk. Might have been afterwards.
Offshore, the Navy was fighting back, but they had to find a way of speeding up the evacuation. And at Dunkirk Harbour, they found it. A mile-long causeway, just 1 yard wide, and never meant for mooring ships. It was called the Dunkirk Mole. And the idea would turn out to be a stroke of genius.
Of all the snap decisions that were made on the spot, for me, that is the greatest decision. The idea to call this great big breakwater into service as something it was never meant to be.
Very quickly, they were loading thousands of men onto the ships, now moored alongside the breakwater. One of the myths of Dunkirk was that most of the soldiers were taken off the beaches by the little ships, when the reality was 2/3 escaped from the Mole.
Maschinen klar zum Flug gegen Dunkirk.
And it didn't take long before the Luftwaffe realized what the British were up to. Once again, and apparently unhindered by the RAF fighters, the Heinkels and the Stukas targeted the Dunkirk Mole and the ships moored alongside it. But an escape from the Mole was no guarantee of safety. 12 miles into the English Channel, on the night of the 29th of May, the soldiers aboard the destroyer HMS Wakeful thought they were safe. But the destroyer suffered one of the most prolonged aerial bombardments of the evacuation. Crippled by dive bombers, she was eventually finished off by torpedoes. Just hours from home, over 600 men were to perish.
And Wakeful was basically broken in half. She broke into two pieces. And what you were left with, had you been there, what you would have seen were two ends of the ship poking out of the water. The upshot of that was that when the ship went down, these people basically didn't have a chance. And they drowned almost immediately. There was one soldier who'd been on deck having a cigarette. He got away. All the rest were drowned.
One of the reasons that the evacuation of Dunkirk has resonated down the decades is that the Navy rescue was joined by a flotilla of privately owned vessels. The so-called little ships, manned by civilian sailors, desperate to do their bit. These are the last survivors of the 700 little ships which helped in the evacuation. For many, they're a poignant reminder of the Dunkirk miracle. But not all the civilian vessels did make it back home. And today, at very low tides, it is still possible to find evidence of one ship's tragic story.
So the captain brought it in, he actually beached it.
Yeah.
And so this is where it's sat ever since then?
Yes.
Joshua Levine is with local historian Johann Samin. Winter storms and unusually low spring tides have revealed evidence of the bravery of the little ships. This is all that's left of the Thames paddle steamer, the Crested Eagle.
So this is the bow, this is the very front.
The very front.
So
yeah.
this here is what would have broken the water here.
Yeah, broken the water.
I see.
Before the war, The Crested Eagle took day trippers from Tower Bridge in London to Southend Pier on the Essex coast. She was used to carrying a full complement of passengers.
So is it quite unusual then to get this view of it?
Yeah, it's abnormal today.
So this is as clear as it's ever
Yes.
On the 29th of May 1940, it was not day trippers, but exhausted British soldiers that the Crested Eagle's captain picked up from the mole at Dunkirk a few miles away.
At about 6 o'clock in the evening, it left the mole. Bear in mind, you know, we're not far from home here. That's the point. You know, these ships were not far away from getting all the troops back to places like Dover and Ramsgate.
Every inch of the paddle steamer was packed with men. But her journey was to be short-lived. With no apparent air cover, the Crested Eagle was easy prey for the Stuka dive bombers.
They came down almost vertically, and they let go of their bomb at a very low altitude. And bear in mind that a ship like Crested Eagle left a very large wake. It was a very clear, obvious target for the Stukas. And they hit it. At least 4 bombs hit it. And there's an account from a sailor who was on board. And this sailor talks about a blazing inferno. He said he saw people walking up and down, and their faces had been blasted off. And their faces were melting, and their arms were melting. He said he saw a lieutenant, and the only way he could recognize this man was from the emblem on his steel helmet. And from that moment on, it was clear that the Crested Eagle wasn't going to survive. But what the captain managed to do, amazingly, was to bring it into shore. And he beached it, which is why we still have it here. And on an extraordinary day like today, when we have this spring tide, we can see so much of it.
These pictures of the Crested Eagle were taken by a German photographer in 1940. They show the devastating results of the Luftwaffe attack. It is thought that 300 men died on the paddle steamer that day. The Allies would lose over 230 ships at Dunkirk. Many of the wrecks littering the beaches bore the deep scars inflicted by the German bombers. It seemed that Goering's Luftwaffe was doing its job. And the men on the beaches were still asking, where were the RAF?
At Dunkirk, the RAF was absolutely detested by the Army and the Navy. And the reason it was detested was because there was this idea from both that the RAF had simply not been there to defend them from the Luftwaffe. Because the Luftwaffe were attacking constantly, and it seemed to the soldiers and the sailors that the RAF was doing nothing to defend them.
But newly released files tell a different story. Far from being absent, unseen from the beaches, the RAF were laying the foundations for the Dunkirk miracle. As the Navy and the little ships were evacuating soldiers from Dunkirk, questions were asked of the RAF. Where were they? Why had they abandoned the men to the Luftwaffe? Resentment soon turned to anger. Wireless operator Arthur Taylor was told to get out of his RAF uniform if he wanted to escape.
This lieutenant came up to me and he said, right, take your shoes off, put some gumboots on, take your jacket off and put this black Macintosh on. Take your hat off and put a tin hat on. I don't want you to be recognised as RAF. And that's how I got on the boat.
The allegations that the RAF had played no part in the evacuation have never really gone away. But is it justified? While researching his book, Joshua Levine has discovered a remarkable recording made by a Dunkirk fighter pilot.
Accession number 11086, Reel 1.
Squadron Leader Bartley, Reel 1.
The recording was made by Squadron Leader Tony Bartley, who recalls the ill feeling against him and his fellow airmen.
The British soldiers were very antagonistic towards the Air Force. Not me personally, but I'd heard about it. I mean, nobody ever said, you son of a bitch, you know, you, one of those bloody wings for you let us down at Dunkirk. But it was a very common experience with fighter pilots.
Squadron Leader Bartley died in 2001. So Joshua has come to the RAF club in London to meet his widow, Vicky, who still has her husband's letters and logbook from Dunkirk.
Hello.
Hello, lovely to see you.
Hello, it's such a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, it's great to see you.
And thank you very much for coming all this way.
Like most RAF fighter pilots at the time, May 1940 was the first occasion the 21-year-old Tony Bartley had been in action.
He had talked to me about Dunkirk, and he had mentioned how they were in, you know, really bad odour with the army and people.
What do you think he meant by that? What was he trying to explain?
Well, he was trying to explain that the army thought that the RAF hadn't done anything and weren't there for them and weren't protecting them.
Vicky Bartley has brought along a letter written by her husband, which shows the true extent of the animosity between the troops and his fellow pilots at the time.
We heard from Pete Cazenove, one of our squadron who was shot down and captured at Dunkirk. He tried to get on 3 destroyers but was turned off each one. The Navy said that all accommodation was reserved for the Army and that the Air Force could go F themselves.
Blimey.
Then there's another bit about Alan Deere, who was another one who was shot down that day. Another friend of mine was in the same predicament, but he knocked out the Navy man who tried to stop him and got himself aboard. He was middleweight champion of the RAF, a New Zealander, and I guess the others thought it best to leave him alone.
Yeah, I mean, this is extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, it is astonishing.
I mean, that is a crime, actually, to do that.
But Tony Bartley's logbook, detailing the very first day 92 Squadron went into action over France, suggests the RAF were in the thick of it.
So this is written by your late husband?
This is written by him, yes, in his logbook, and it's on the 23rd of May, and it says, patrol, encountered 12 ME-109s, 10 shot down by squadron, Pat Learmont killed, patrol encountered about 50 ME-110s and bombers.
So many bullets flying around. And the whole sky was just bullets flying everywhere. I don't know how many we shot at and damaged. You just went on until you ran out of ammunition.
Missing Bushell, Gillis, Klitsch, Paddy wounded, Cazenove missing, patrol encountered Dornier 17, shot down in sea, 1 parachute escape. I mean, that was all that day.
I got hit 18 times in the morning and 12 times in the afternoon. But I thought this was par for the course.
The losses suffered by Bartley's squadron that day were high.
If this shows anything, it's that the RAF was in the thick of the fight.
But they were, absolutely.
Tony Bartley's vivid accounts fly in the face of the soldiers' claims that the RAF were absent at Dunkirk. Now, at the National Archives in London, RAF files kept closed for 7 decades have just been released, and they seem to support Bartley's claims. They paint the most accurate picture yet of what was happening in the skies over Dunkirk.
There are roughly 200 files that cover the Dunkirk period from 26th of May to the 2nd of June, so the main period of lifting men off the beaches.
The Dunkirk casualty files are part of a larger group of RAF records, opened each time an airman failed to return from a mission. Historian Simon Parry has studied the documents in forensic detail, and he's been left in no doubt that the soldiers had simply got it wrong.
The RAF were given a hard time immediately after Dunkirk, but it's completely unjustified. It's really a view of the poor soldier on the beach waiting to be lifted off, and it was a view born more of ignorance than of any substance.
From the RAF casualty files, it's possible to plot the crash site of every RAF plane lost during the Battle of France and the Dunkirk evacuation. What it shows is the RAF losing vast numbers of aircraft trying to slow the German advance toward the coast.
Their job, their task, if you like, was to give the troops on the beach a maximum chance of getting away and to hinder the Luftwaffe, and so the RAF succeeded in their aim.
One reason the troops couldn't see the RAF was because the airmen were fighting further inland, shooting down large numbers of German planes before they could even reach the soldiers on the beaches. And there was another reason.
The battles were being fought at great height, 4 or 5 miles above them, and there's no way that the troops on the beach could see what the RAF were doing.
Simon's research from the files also reveals that huge numbers of RAF planes were being lost out at sea as pilots tried to stop the Luftwaffe bombing the ships and the beaches.
The fact that the soldiers didn't see the Spitfires and Hurricanes whizzing round their heads is immaterial. But nevertheless, they had a view, I didn't see them, they weren't in my eyesight. And so you have these attacks on them saying, well, where was the bloody RAF?
The files show that at the start of the Blitzkrieg, the RAF were suffering unsustainable losses in their attempts to hold back the German army. Then something remarkable happened. Somehow, the RAF turned the tide. A clue to this dramatic transformation can be found in the casualty file belonging to squadron leader Geoffrey Stevenson. Remarkably, Stevenson's squadron of just 12 RAF fighters saw off an attack force of 50 German aircraft. The reason behind this outstanding performance was the aircraft Stevenson was flying that day, the Mark I Supermarine Spitfire. This was the first time the Spitfire had faced the Luftwaffe, and it would go on to change the course of the Second World War. Unlike the Hurricane, which had been in France since the start of the conflict, in May 1940 the Spitfire was completely untested. Stevenson's Spitfire was eventually shot down over France, but Dunkirk was not to be its final resting place.
Hello, John. Don't pretend you're working.
Steve Vizard and John Romaine have both spent a lifetime restoring Second World War fighter planes.
Yeah, it's going well, actually. It's going very well.
You busy?
Yeah.
It was from Duxford Aerodrome in Cambridgeshire that Geoffrey Stevenson and his squadron of Spitfires were based in May 1940. And this is the very Spitfire he flew over Dunkirk.
So here she is, Steve, N3200.
Yeah, Geoffrey Stevenson, fresh from Dunkirk.
Fresh from Dunkirk.
And she's exactly the same markings now as...
Yeah, she was then.
She was.
Exactly down to the last detail.
Squadron leader Stevenson was in action near Dunkirk on May the 26th, 1940, when his Spitfire, N3200, was shot down in combat.
And of course this aeroplane was lost with one bullet going through one of these pipes.
Yeah.
And that was enough to
overheat.
And he then knew he wasn't going to get back to England, so that's why he bellied the aeroplane down on the beach.
Geoffrey Stevenson survived the crash, and for a while in the summer of 1940, his Spitfire became something of a tourist attraction for the German soldiers now occupying France. It eventually disappeared beneath the sand and the sea. In 1986, Stevenson's aircraft was recovered, but it would take almost 30 years before the Spitfire was fully restored.
And you can actually see the guns, the breeches up there, can't you?
Yeah, you can. You look in there, they're in there.
Yeah.
Armed with 8 machine guns set in the Spitfire's revolutionary elliptical wings, the Mark I was built for high-speed maneuvers. Britain's newest fighter could outmatch any German plane. Especially when tweaked with a few personal touches.
The early aeroplanes, they didn't have rear-view mirrors at all. So once they started to get into combat, they realised that they needed a mirror. And so before they could start putting them on the aeroplanes in production, all the pilots started running around producing their own mirrors. And this was Geoffrey's version of it. And it was the mirror from his MG.
For the Spitfire pilots like Geoffrey Stevenson and Tony Barclay, Dunkirk was the first time they would go into battle. Here they would face German airmen who already had combat experience in Poland as well as Spain. And from the start, the Spitfire pilots began to make a difference.
You see, what we did at Dunkirk, we turned them back. Although we were only 12, you know, we used to molest them and they'd just turn around and they'd just take off.
The Dunkirk miracle owed as much to the brilliance of the RAF as it did to the Navy and the little ships. But it was the Spitfire and its untested pilots who really made it possible. The lessons they learned at Dunkirk would prove invaluable, because the Germans were not about to stop at the English Channel, and the Spitfires would fly into legend. By the 4th of June 1940, the Dunkirk evacuation was over, and for the soldiers of the BEF who had managed to get away, it was a short journey across the English Channel and a glorious homecoming.
Could feel the boat going up and down with the waves. I was so tired, I fell asleep. Next thing I knew, someone was shaking me, saying, "Wake up, we're coming into Folkestone."
Over the course of 9 days, almost 340,000 troops were safely evacuated from Dunkirk. Back in England, they were greeted with a hero's welcome.
Waiting on the quayside were all these WVS with cakes and tea and that, because where I'd been shot, they'd torn my battle dress. It was a bit blood-stained, and all these ladies made a grab for me to take care of their wounded hero. And I was in more danger from them ladies than any bloody German.
Most would return to barracks, while the fortunate would go home to their families.
They put me on a train where my father lived, and I got onto the train and came out at Three Bridges, and my usual ticket collector said, "Welcome home, sir. We thought you was lost." I don't understand it. They welcomed us as heroes. They clapped us and cheered us. I simply didn't understand it.
Only the British can turn a defeat into a victory.
Winston Churchill described Dunkirk as a miracle of deliverance. He had expected to report the greatest military disaster in Britain's history. At the beginning, Churchill had estimated that as few as 20,000 troops would get away. And yet in the end, the Royal Navy would rescue over 1/3 soldiers. But many thousands would not make it home, and they are commemorated here at the British War Cemetery on the outskirts of Dunkirk.
I think it's absolutely fair to say that Dunkirk was a miracle. It was a miracle of deliverance in the way Churchill spoke about it. Dunkirk is an incredibly important event, because if the British Expeditionary Force had been taken prisoner, the likelihood is that Britain would have had to surrender. If Britain had surrendered, the war would have been over at that point.
The pilots of RAF Fighter Command had played their part in keeping Britain in the war, and the Luftwaffe knew it too. Kesselring, the general in charge of the German Air Force at Dunkirk, acknowledged that in the end, it was the Spitfire which enabled the British to evacuate across the water. Goering had halted the German advance for his bombers to finish off the British Army. But he hadn't reckoned on the Spitfire. The RAF lost 900 planes, but 1,400 Luftwaffe aircraft was stopped from reaching the beaches. Just as important, the Spitfire pilots were learning valuable lessons.
My God, it was important to get that experience, to get that training, to basically gear itself up for the fight that was to come.
Just 6 weeks after Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain would transform the RAF's tarnished reputation. In the skies over southern England, the pilots of Fighter Command would defeat the Luftwaffe and save Britain from invasion. But it was at Dunkirk that the RAF had first come of age. Today, Squadron Leader Geoffrey Stevenson's restored Mark I Spitfire is on a special mission. For the first time in 77 years, it returns to the skies where he and his fellow pilots learned their trade. It was over the beaches of Dunkirk the pilots realized with the Spitfire they had a machine that could save the day.
Who got the Expeditionary Force off the beachhead? We did.
One of those Spitfire pilots, Tony Barclay, who was in combat at Dunkirk, was in no doubt as to who really did save the BEF.
Who got him off? Fire Command. Let's not kid ourselves.
Only now can we appreciate the crucial role this remarkable aircraft played in the evacuation of over 300,000 men.
They call it the miracle of Dunkirk. Yeah, it was a miracle.
And for those who did get home, the memories of that miracle remain with them.
You're thinking about it all the time. Day in, day out. Dunkirk. It never goes away.
on our own. And we came back. It was a miracle at Dunkirk. We rose again from the ashes.
Starting next Saturday at 7, Following the Roots of Legend, Britain's Ancient Tracks with Tony Robinson. Next tonight, retracing the footsteps of the daring POWs who fled the camps, the freedom trails of World War II's Great Escapes.